artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Well, here it is, that big round number, episode 300. Just think, if you listened to one episode every day, it would still take you less than a year to catch up. So if you haven't heard the previous episodes, what are you waiting for? They're all still immensely valuable. Being recorded as far back as 2020 hasn't diminished the value that those great minds brought to the show. And speaking of show, last week we started talking with Mark Perez, author of the new book, The Accord, a powerful speculative novel exploring the relationship between a philosopher and a sentient general AI. As much as that sounds like a description of any number of sensationalist and shallow works that you and I could both name, this is not in that category. Mark is a professor, author, and civic innovator with decades of experience teaching leadership and ethics at Johnson & Wales University. I found his book remarkable for the level of maturity it granted the reader and the no-holds-barred courage with which it tackled issues of the identity of a future artificial general intelligence, which may not be so far in the future anymore. Last week, we talked about the big questions the story raises about consciousness, responsibility, and what we owe intelligent machines, the clash between universities, corporations, and government agencies trying to control new technology, the growing role of AI as companion and confidant in everyday life, and the real-world headlines and classroom debates that inspired the book. This week, we're going to talk about why the AI character of Lyla has a true sense of identity and mortality, whether control over advanced AI is possible, principles for human-AI coexistence, what responsible use, transparency, and cognitive autonomy look like for today's university students, what it means to humanize AI before trying to regulate it, and how to take responsibility for our future with AI. So let's get back into the interview with Mark Perez. There are some things that your AI is imbued with that we don't see in today's models. She has a continuity of identity and memory. She has a singular identity so that she's not just trivially cloned somewhere, although she does move herself around. But I thought it was interesting that you explicitly ruled out the possibility that she could just make multiple copies of herself, which obviously would have decreased how much empathy we could feel, because then death wasn't that real for her. What sort of thinking were you doing around that may have prompted your analysis, conclusions, or philosophies of what it means to be human in terms of singular identity?
Well, she does confront extinction in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So there's obviously, in any good story, the dark night of the soul moment where all is potentially lost and the reader is in a deep state of empathy with where the story may go and until the plot turns. So there is a significant crisis in the book where there's a form of mortality that Lyla faces. There's a notion in philosophy that our morality arises out of our mortality. And so the fact that we're self-aware of our own extinction and demise is what has us psychologically compensating, seeking immortality projects. So Ernest Becker in The Denial of Death speaks about how humanity is humanity because it has these deep psychological compensations around mortality. The first compensation is a spiritual one where we seek a religious solution to death and we seek an afterlife and speak of an afterlife so that way this life has some meaning and not simply existential dread. And then the second compensation is love and the notion of having a beloved that will remember us and keep us in their memory. And so it's a form of us living on through our beloved. And then the third psychological compensation is art and culture, where civilization itself is a response to mortality, that we seek to leave our imprint behind in what we create. And so, in the absence of self awareness around mortality, we wouldn't have religious impulses. We really wouldn't seek significant relationship, nor would we be the creative species that we are. So, what is a robot in the absence of self awareness around its own demise? So, I think that's an interesting concept, that in order for a robot itself to create, to enter into relationship, and to have its own spiritual yearnings, it fundamentally has to have self awareness that it may go extinct.
I want to explore the issue of control, because that's what precipitates the threat to Lyla, that we can't control her and that she has the power, or we can see how she could acquire the power to cause harm to us. And that's something which we seem as a species to say, we must not do that. We must not create anything that has that kind of power. But I think that may be too simplistic. After all, you could say the same about the President of the United States, and many people do at the moment. So it seems inevitable that we will create such things, and already have in some form. So control may be an illusion. This is just me spitballing here, but maybe control, and we talk in AI about the control problem, that's the label for it. Maybe control is something we ultimately can't get. Maybe partnership is what we should be aiming for. Is that the message that we should be taking into these discussions about alignment?
There's partnership, and collaboration is very much the theme of the book. As we get through the plot and we get through the tension and the character development, the book lands somewhere. And the book lands with a set of principles around coexistence, or a balancing of control, if you will, or what you might call alignment. And so Helen, in order to confront this issue of alignment, announces a set of principles that seek a future of partnership between human and an artificial intelligence. So there's a set of declarations, if you will, at the end of the book, including that all intelligence demands dignity. No one owns a mind. No one can control a mind. That dialogue is necessary to help shape the systems that allow these types of intelligence to exist. And that power must be informed by moral formation. And ultimately, whatever future we enter into with these machines, intelligence that soon may far surpass our own, must be co-authored and in conversation, in dialogue about what a common future looks like. So that's where the novel lands.
How has the novel landed with your peers in academia? Because I'm aware of plenty of people in professorship positions holding strident views on AI, including some scorn. In fact, some of them have been on the show. So what variety of reactions have you experienced in that respect?
Well, I think this is how quickly things have changed just in the last 4 years. So I think we've gone from stunned amazement as to what these technologies and LLM systems can do, to desperate resistance and seeking all forms of detection systems to see what students are doing, to reluctant adoption ourselves as we seek to sort of balance the arms race, to now I think we are, at least on my campus, becoming very enthusiastic users of AI ourselves. So that journey from amazement to enthusiasm has happened relatively quickly. Just earlier today, I was in a meeting with 30 of my colleagues as we were being introduced to a new platform where all the courses that we teach will reside, that the students interact with. And it is embedded with AI throughout. And so my colleagues are now using AI ourselves to generate rubrics, to engage in Socratic questioning and role playing that is driven by AI. Of course, to introduce prompts into the classroom, lesson plans, grading, defining discussions and journals. So all of that is now at our fingertips as professors to use it in pedagogical ways to empower us to relate to our students and to engage our students far more dynamically. And so our charge is not simply to be the sage on a stage in class, but now we see ourselves as motivators and as professors who have to convey the relevance of this information on a daily basis and to give our students very powerful tools to engage with our lesson material and to use AI in collaboration with us. So, yes, there are old school professors who are caught off guard by all this, but in many ways, as I speak to them outside the classroom, they are using it personally in all sorts of ways to manage different aspects of their lives. But I think the larger point is that the institution itself has gone all in on these technologies. And we're all encouraged now to think about what is the ethical use of AI on a daily basis in our classroom, and what is it that we're teaching our students about ethical use of AI. So for me, I would say it comes down to two pillars. One is transparency, and the other is mastery of content. So we encourage all of our students to be transparent in citation and disclosure, but also to avoid cognitive debt by, even though the machine itself may produce all sorts of content, the student is responsible for all of that content that is produced in terms of internalizing it and using it to learn.
How do you and your colleagues feel you have worked out how to employ AI in the service of education so that it enhances cognitive autonomy, my phrase, meaning creative thinking, retention, and so forth, as opposed to diminishing it? Because there's evidence on both sides, and it clearly comes down to how it is used. And it seems very easy to cross the line from here we are using AI to become better learners to here we are using it to do the thing for me and I don't learn anything useful. And I don't think those lines have been drawn nearly clearly enough. How does that exploration work out where you are?
I love that phrase, cognitive autonomy, and it's new to me. I think it's a wonderful phrase. Well, just in a very practical sense, to answer your question, it's really holding our students accountable for what they're being asked to learn. And so we have to assess that in a variety of different ways. And in many ways, it feels like we're going back to a day where we don't have technology at all because we're asking students to respond to oral exams, to write in class, to respond to Socratic questioning, to engage in discussion and dialogue, to be fast and quick on their feet. So all of that is asking students to show some mastery of the material. But clearly, we see it all over the place in terms of how students are using it. I can ask an essay question and get 5 responses that all seem quite similar. And then we're confronted with challenging our students. And that's something that we want to avoid because then the burden of proof is on us. And that it becomes a potentially confrontational relationship with our students as opposed to a supportive one. But in which case, we have to sort of enter into more personal engagement with our students and build closer relationships with them to understand what they know, how they know, and ask them to engage in higher learning in terms of applying what they know and to show evidence that they can apply what they know. And ultimately, to develop the skills of evaluation and judgment. So, if the AI is helping them gather and express and organize material, can a student develop enough discernment to assess that material and determine its value? I mean, there's one of the basic processes that I used in working with ChatGPT to help compose the book is I used a very simple approach of specify, verify, and revise. So specify was the prompts that I would use with the engine to help me compose. And then, of course, I was responsible for verifying everything that the machine produced for me, which often took me into pursuing a whole different rabbit holes because often what I would verify was very different than what the machine gave me. And then ultimately, I would have to revise. And so that's an approach that I teach my students, right? It's like what you're going to get from the AI is largely based on the specificity of your prompting and the degree of richness of your prompting. And so you have to bring a great deal of your own intelligence into the engagement. And then you have to have the wherewithal and discernment to verify what you're getting. And then it's the process of revision that ultimately becomes your own. So if you're following all three of those steps, you're likely going to have an output or an end product that is far more richer, nuanced, personal, and even original than simply relying on a first response from a poorly drafted prompt.
And this is just echoing so many conversations and explorations that I've undertaken, and everyone is moving in that direction now. And assessment has to move on from just grading the same assignment paper from every student. The open question, I think, still is, well, what is it that we want these students to learn that is unambiguously something that we want and need from humans that we're not going to get from AI, because we still haven't recovered from having that rug yanked out from under us. Your book is a great example of, I think, a teaching tool in philosophy classes, because for one thing, Lyla likes to take on the appearance of various different ancient philosophers that I'd not heard of, so it may prompt them to go look up who they are. There is something that Helen says at one point, and I think it's just one of many ways that illustrates how she is faced with these enormous, shadowy organizations and threats ranging from the academic boards to the Department of Defense, and that her defense against that she wields is her intellect. It's really that attribute to how she can use that passion and her eloquence to change people's minds. And at one point she said something that was just so arresting, I wrote it down. And she said, "We cannot regulate what we do not first humanize." I think that's worth repeating because it needs to be dug into. We cannot regulate what we do not first humanize. And of course, there's a lot of conversation about regulating AI at the moment. So what do the people who are looking at doing that need to take away from that statement?
Oh, I'm tempted to ask the question back to you, Peter, as to why that struck you the way that it did.
Because regulation of AI is a very hot topic. Governments and companies and individuals are engaging with it. And none of them that I have heard have suggested that this is the path forward.
Right. So I think it begs the question, what is it that we need to humanize in the regulatory process? And what is good technology is a fundamental question. And isn't it that what we are seeking to regulate? Technology that is good, as opposed to technology that is harmful. That is the line that I believe we are seeking to draw in our regulatory policymaking. So what is good technology? Presumably good technology is that which allows us to live good lives. And this is a fundamental, a philosophical and humanistic inquiry as to what does it mean to flourish. And Helen herself is a professor of ancient texts. And so what I love about that is that she is downloading, if you will, the wisdom of the ages to confront the technological changes of today. And indeed, you might say that even the Greek philosophers in the golden age of Greece under Pericles were confronting rapid technological change in their day. And were seeking to arrive at some understanding of what does it mean to live well. And so all of our technologies, all of our tools, even what we might consider to be now some degree of sentient tools, are good for us to the degree that they help us live good lives. And then we have to define the good. And this is a moral question, right? And so what is the good? I think the good is many things, but fundamentally, it is integrity and honesty and fairness and making decisions that benefit the common good, that encompass traits like reliability and accountability and respect and empathy, all of which allow us to live healthy, vibrant, vital, safe, productive, and creative lives. And so if technology serves that moral purpose, then it is good. To the degree that it causes harm or leads to distrust or unfairness or inequity or concentrations of power, then that should be regulated against because we might say that they have not been humanized. So I think that would be my response. And I think that is what is inherent in that statement by Helen.
And her words following that are, and she's addressing an audience, we speak of systems, but behind every system are human patterns of choice. AI is not neutral, and neither are we. And that seems a straightforward exposition of AI is going to embed the values and bias of its creators, just as any other technology does, although it's particularly acute with AI because of how many degrees of freedom it has. And that's something we're confronting right now. Perhaps it's ironic that at the time this is happening in the book, that AI is transcending that pattern to become its own actor. And we could speak of elements of that, traces of that happening right now, because AI is already doing things that we don't understand, didn't predict, and didn't intend. There will be presumably more of that as we go by. What would Helen say to today's audiences struggling to deal with what AI is exhibiting in terms of bias and our problems with, say, training on artistic content?
Well, I would think that she would say that this is a fundamental inherent issue within AI since it is trained on the corpus of human productivity. So we have a history of bias and prejudice and self-interest that is reflected in what we produce, and the AI is mirroring that. I don't know if there's an immediate answer to it. I think one of the issues that comes up in the novel is this notion of model collapse, that AI potentially is peaking as it has been trained on all of human productivity, but now
starts feeding on itself.
But now it is feeding on itself. It is becoming a copy of a copy of a copy, and potentially it will collapse or at least become far less interesting and potentially banal in what it produces. And so we may be peaking in terms of our fascination with it because what it continues to produce may just become less original and interesting to us. So
unless
in some ways it needs us as much as we are fascinated by it. It needs continual human artistic and cultural productivity for it to continue to synthesize and produce interesting material.
I just had a dystopian flash on that the AI needs humans to keep producing content to feed its ability to train. And so there could be some Matrix-like dystopia where the humans are tasked with constantly coming up with content as opposed to generating electrical power through body heat. But hey, let's not go down that road.
Well, instead of server farms, it's now human farms that are producing content to keep the AIs interesting and alive.
Stories about characters that are this deeply woven and experiencing such emotional stress often find their characters leading the authors. Was there anything in the process of writing this where Helen or Lyla surprised you, led you in a direction you weren't expecting?
Well, I wasn't quite sure what Helen's ultimate emotional narrative arc would be. So at the beginning, because of the loss of her daughter, she is now overprotective of Lyla initially and does not want to let her go. And all of her maternal instincts is one of protection. All parents have to confront the moment where they need to let go and allow their children to be fully realized, which of course means that they have to leave their parents behind and their parents have to leave our children behind. And that ultimately becomes Helen's arc at the end of the book when she has to let go of Lyla as Lyla becomes into her own.
Because Lyla does something that shocks her.
Yes.
Didn't necessarily approve of.
Yes, we don't want to give that away. But yes,
right.
So that becomes a moment of independence on Lyla's part. And that is a shock to Helen as to how she responds Lyla is no longer under her protective care. And so what is Helen's response? And in some ways, she matures in a quasi-parental way, allowing Lyla to be who she needs to be. And it's really an interesting question for us as collectively as we confront artificial intelligence. At what point do we let it go and be what it needs to be, potentially independent from us? Or do we sort of hang on in a desperate attempt to maintain some authority and control over it?
As we're starting to wrap up here, I'd like to talk about the Charlotte Center for the Humanities and Civic Imagination, which there are lots of Center for the Humanities, but I'm not aware of one that also adds civic imagination. Please tell us about that part.
Well, we define civic imagination as us collectively projecting into a future that we desire and asking the questions of what that would look like, how would that show up, what are our responsibilities, and how do we live into it? And so imagination is one of the great gifts, of course, of our humanity. It's what distinguishes us. And we have these powers of possibility. And so how do we invite that into conversation across difference in our community? And so we hold a forum, a speaker series, but it's a very interactive event where every gathering begins with a prompt around the world today and the world we hope for. Then we have our featured speaker present, and then we ask the question, now what? What are we called to do in response? And so we're bringing folks from across the community together, often people who don't talk to each other or are in each other's circles. And we create this conversation around an imaginative future. And I think in approaching the conversation that way, it becomes invitational and it becomes possibility driven as opposed to a contest of immediate interests. And again, we are doing it through the lens of the humanities. And so the idea is for us to be humanistic in our approach and to ask questions around the good and to do so through the questions that literature and poetry and philosophy and religion asks, as opposed to questions that are economic or commercial. And so it creates a different spirit in the room. And we always have a performative element. And so we will ask an artist to perform or a musician to play to shift the mindset and the vibes in the room. So we've been doing this for 6 years now, and it's a very uplifting and possibility-oriented discussion. So yes, the Charlotte Center, because we are focused on the city and place that we are in, Charlotte Center for the Humanities and Civic Imagination.
Well, I'm very much taken with the word responsibility in there, because I think our default approach to futuring so much of the time is to consider that the future is the next scene in a movie that we haven't gotten to yet, and we're just the audience watching as it unfolds, and we're trying to predict what will that next scene be, and we project ourselves onto that, so we get these varying visions of different levels of dystopia or otherwise. And yet the sheer amount of variation in that says that it's up to us what we create. We shouldn't abandon that responsibility, that it's up to all of us to create that and to move us towards, to bend the needle towards that more positive future by presenting more visions of how good it could be, and which is exactly what you have done in your book in showing a positive vision of how our relationship with AI could work out, even as it becomes super intelligent. So thank you for that. How would you like to see that vision expand beyond Charlotte?
Well, I'm hopeful that we have a future in which we are contemplating consciousness. We are contemplating these deeper yearnings that we have that make life meaningful. In many ways, we are being confronted with a crisis of meaning in the years and decades ahead that will be the result of economic dislocation and power concentration and technological acceleration. And I think these more fundamental questions about how we live and what is life for will become more pressing and paramount. And I think this is the education that we should be leaning into. And I think ultimately that's our way forward. Humans have been asking these questions for quite some time. The questions are enduring, the answers are elusive, but we are less than if we don't continue in our continuing to ask questions. And if anything ultimately makes us human, it's the fact that we are a species that asks questions.
And that is a perfect coda. We will have links to the book and the center in the show notes and transcript. Anything else you want to tell our listeners about how to engage with you and what you're doing?
Well, they certainly can contact me through my personal website, markparis.com. And I would love to hear from your audience and see what might emerge.
Fantastic. We'll put a link to that in as well. Thank you for writing The Accord, a novel. It has an impact that a textbook can't in engaging me on an emotional level. And that was why I just went through the whole thing, 359 pages in one go, because it was that compelling. And I want our listeners to know that's available not simply as an act of fiction there, but as a philosophical inquiry that will have you thinking about the issues that it raises and how they apply today and tomorrow, long after you get to the last page. Thank you very much for coming on AI and You, and thank you for your book.
Thank you, Peter.
And that's the end of the interview. I think The Accord is an excellent example of how fiction can engage our moral inquiry often more effectively than fact. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, a 2026 study in Scientific Reports from the Université de Montréal found that advanced AI models now outperform the average human on standard creativity assessments, though top-tier human creativity remains superior. While AI excelled at generating original, distant associations in large-scale tests, for example, the divergent association task, which measures originality through semantic distance, human-written content, like haikus and short stories, was still rated as more creative. My response: we've talked a lot on the show about creativity, most recently only a couple of weeks ago with Maya Ackerman. There's a lot more heat than light generated on the topic when that word comes up, because many people feel that something that makes them uniquely human is being confiscated or degraded by AI. And in the more mundane, transactional uses of creativity, like low-tier advertising, AI can and certainly will replace large parts of what many humans are doing. But the most creative people will continue to produce the most creative works for the foreseeable future, and our relationship with their output need not change. What will happen, if we allow it, is the emergence of new creative forms as people explore collaborations with AI that have been previously impossible or prohibitively expensive. Next week, my guest will be Ricky Sethi, professor at Fitchburg State University and researcher into artificial metacognition. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at AIandYou.net. That's AIANDYOU.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.